Hi, my name is David Alvarado. I'm one of the directors and producers and the cinematographer for We Are As Gods.
Hi, I'm Jason Sussberg, and I am one of the director producers of We Are As Gods.
Stewart is a lot like the great American P.T. Barnum.
Well, Stewart is the intellectual Johnny Appleseed of the counterculture.
Stewart might be the Zelig or maybe the Da Vinci of cyberculture.
It's actually a little bit eerie how often Stewart has been at the right place at the right time.
For instance, other entities like an invisible string.
And by the time all the rest of us get there, he's gone on to something else more interesting.
Stewart has this remarkable Forrest Gump superpower.
I believe he said he had to go pee.
To sense where the frontiers are and then be there. He's like Kilroy. You know, he shows up in the background of every important thing going on.
He could see into the future that this technology was going to be a huge part of American culture.
We welcome Mr. Stewart Brand.
It isn't so much that he's ahead of it, he's actually creating the future. Steve Jobs, not surprisingly, was fascinated by Stewart.
When I was young, the Whole Earth Catalogue was one of the Bibles of my generation. It was created by a fellow named Stewart Brand. It was sort of like Google in paperback form 35 years before Google came along.
So many of the ideas that you may find vital either originate with Stewart Brand or were really articulated by him.
Ideas that seem at the edge of believability, from the environmental movement to the technological movement to genetics.
He's also a stubborn bastard.
Stu loves being the technophile who has the answer.
He had an understanding that humans were on a trajectory towards greater and technical possibilities. And he made an important statement: we are as gods, so we might as well get good at it.
That is the trailer for the soon-to-be-released documentary, We Are As Gods. And this is Factual America. Factual America is produced by Alamo Pictures, a production company specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for an international audience. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood, and every week we look at America through the lens of documentary filmmaking by interviewing filmmakers and experts on the American experience. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to be the first to hear about new productions, to find out where you can see our films, and to connect with our team. Stewart Brand is a Renaissance man who has been at the forefront of many societal trends since the 1960s, literally launching the modern environmental movement and mentoring giants of the tech revolution like Steve Jobs. In his latest incarnation, Stewart is trying to bring back the woolly mammoth and other species from extinction. Is this folly, or just another example of Stewart being ahead of the curve yet again? Recently, we caught up with David Alvarado and Jason Sussberg, the producers and directors of We Are As Gods, which is about Stewart Brand. In the process, we found out what it's like to have your premiere canceled and learned about the challenges of releasing a film in the middle of a global pandemic. David Alvarado and Jason Sussberg, welcome to Factual America.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Hey, so how are you doing? Where are you guys? Are you both in New York? David, maybe you start off for us.
Sure. No, I'm in New York, here in Brooklyn. Jason's in San Francisco. So it makes for an interesting work relationship. You know, we're 3,000 miles apart at all times. But he's in a city that handled the coronavirus a little bit better than my city did, for sure.
Yeah, I saw something recently. New York was more akin to northern Italy, and California was more akin to Germany, if you're making European comparisons. But what about, it's been an interesting few months. I'm trying not to be glib about this, but and also the last week or so. I mean, have you been affected by the demonstrations and now also the riots going on?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, New York is really, it really is. So we're getting hit twice. You know, there's the plague, and then there's the riots, and so it's insane. Going outside to get groceries is pretty interesting right now.
How about you, Jason?
I mean, yeah, it's been it just has nothing to do with the film, but it's just been interesting watching more or less it feels like a revolution happening literally outside my apartment in San Francisco. I live downtown in the Mission District, and we just had a major mobilization happen yesterday that shut down all of traffic, and we had tens of thousands of people on the street fighting for police reform. So it's it definitely feels like COVID has sort of taken a back burner of ever-pressing concern, and right now it's everyone's focused on police brutality and racial justice. It's heartwarming, but I'm also worried that there's going to be a second wave.
I guess on both fronts, in some ways.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think we can later in the hopefully in the podcast we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about your personal experiences and also how this is affecting the project. But the film, our listeners have just heard a intro to about your film, We Are as Gods. Gives us a little background, mentions a fellow named Stewart Brand. Now, I ask this question every show often because there are a lot of listeners out there who may not know or are too young to remember certain famous individuals. But literally, I would think this is the most influential person that none of us has ever heard of. And indeed, I think the film just scratches the surface in some ways about who Stewart Brand is. But David, maybe you can kick us off. Tell us a little bit about who Stewart Brand is.
Yeah, well, Stewart Brand is an interesting character. Like you say, he's been involved in all sorts of cultural keystone moments from the 60s onward that everybody knows about, but nobody really knows his name. And if you do, you're probably already a Stewart Brand fan, or you really disagree with him and think he's a villain. And so he's a perfect character for a documentary in some ways. We think that in Silicon Valley especially, he's sort of just been behind the scenes in key moments, especially in technology and conservationism. So the film tries to weave that story onto the tapestry of what he's doing now, which is sort of the focus of the film, which is he's trying to de-extinct, or rather resurrect extinct species in order to fight climate change, which is interesting to say the least.
I mean, I think you make a very good point about weaving this story on this tapestry about what he's doing now. But while you are very artful, we're going to be fairly boring here at Factual American, take a much more linear approach. And I think, David, you and I caught up a little while ago, and you sort of described him as this Zelig or Forrest Gump character. Well, Jason, why don't we start at, not at the very beginning, but sort of the beginning of when Stewart really sort of rose to fame, and that's kind of the beginnings of the 60s counterculture movement. I mean, Ken Kesey, Merry Pranksters, you could say he's the founder of the Haight Ashbury scene in the 60s. Do you want to say a little something about that, especially since I think you're just a stone's throw away?
Yeah, that's right. I just was at Haight Ashbury yesterday, actually. Stewart, at that point in the late 60s, Stewart was in his late 20s, and that's when he really became a public figure. Before that, he was sort of in and around the San Francisco Peninsula area, Silicon Valley, what became Silicon Valley, but he was a Stanford student. And around the late 60s, he got involved with a character named Ken Kesey, who was a sort of a roustabout in the counterculture scene and was sort of popularizing LSD and what became the psychedelic counterculture scene. And Stewart a lot of people saw him as adult supervision for these young hippies because he was in his late 20s. And so what Stewart was doing was sort of at the periphery. He wasn't really involved in anything directly, but he was just a merry prankster going around with Ken Kesey. And then that all changed in 66 when Stewart started getting involved in major acid tests, bigger and bolder acid tests, and sort of merging them into these like sensational concerts married with interactive psychedelic art.
And yet, it's it's not so much they had a falling out with that scene, but he I think there's a part in the film where he talks about he just kind of wanted to be his own man. I guess that's also a theme of Stewart Brand, that Ken Kesey was the charismatic leader of this Merry Pranksters crowd, and Stewart wanted to kind of find himself.
Yeah, that's accurate to say. I think he additionally he wanted to take agency and be his own person, but also at the time, I think he recognized that there was an end point to what they were doing. Like Stewart famously wants to start things and then leave it up to the people and then move on to the next. And at that point, I think he saw that the sort of the writing on the wall, that it was this movement, the 60s, the counterculture scene had achieved what it was going to achieve, and now it needed to become something else, and it was time to move on. So I think Stewart just has a really uncanny nose for sensing what's popular in the popular culture and sort of riding that wave, and then eventually starting something new.
Well, I mean, starting about on that point about having a nose for these things and sort of being always ahead of the curve. David, then we had this about the same time. He got this. He had an acid trip and decided that we all needed to see an image of the Earth from outer space. I didn't know the backgrounds of the story. Some might be familiar with this. Al Gore talks about it in An Inconvenient Truth. But maybe talk us through this a little bit. It's basically the beginnings of the modern environmental movement, as I understand it.
Yeah, it could be viewed that way. I mean, it's interesting because, someone, my age, I just grew up with images of the Earth in the middle school, in the classrooms, right? Like I just knew what the world looked like from a photograph from outer space. But in a lot of people's living memory, that was not always the case, and the early 60s, and just imagine in the 1950s, your idea of Earth was either a drawn map or, a globe, which, was a representation of the Earth, but it wasn't quite the same thing as seeing a photograph. Like a photograph, as we all know, it can have such an impact on people. There's photographs that have changed the course of entire cultures or wars. If you think back to Vietnam. And so the power of seeing the Earth in a photograph was something that Stewart started thinking about during this acid trip. It's just like, well, wait a minute, what does it actually look like? I mean, what would the impact be if somebody could see the planet that we live on? Like everything you've ever known could be captured in one square frame of a photograph. Like what kind of impact would that have on how we think about, the preciousness of the world? And so he began a campaign to try to get NASA to release these photographs because, it was already the case that we had satellites up in the air. There must have been somebody thinking about taking a photograph of the whole damn thing. And through a course of asking NASA, of asking congressmen, he even put on a sandwich board and passed out buttons that said, "Why haven't we seen the whole Earth?" To places in different colleges and so on. And so he was sort of just a one-man campaign to try to get this photograph out into the public. And so when NASA finally did release the photograph, it was something that a lot of people look back and say, well, that's interesting. It was around the time that we got that photograph that a lot of these organizations started popping up, the beginning of a sort of new, much more modern era of conservationism and environmentalism, and even the image of the Earth itself began landing on flags and other things. It became an icon. It became a symbol for this is home, and we're all in the same home together. Let's all take care of it together. So, it's funny because it's not like NASA said, "Oh, hey, Stewart Brand, thanks for asking. Here you go." It wasn't so direct, but it was something that he saw on the horizon, and something that might have an impact in a systematic and large scale cultural way. And sure enough, when it arrived, it did have that impact. And so it's interesting because his life is full of stories just like that. And when you think about his mission today to resurrect extinct species, he's actually more interested in animals like the woolly mammoth, not just because he wants more mammoths. He wants mammoths back on the planet, living in their ecosystem and playing their role. He does want that. But it's also because of the symbol, the icon, the image of a mammoth on the Siberian tundra would change how humanity thinks about our role in taking care of the animals under our stewardship. So he wants us to be inspired to do a better job of being conservationists.
And I think then it was long after that that he started the Whole Earth Catalogue, which I was not aware of, and it's targeted to the communal living crowd, I guess. Jason, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I guess it was a couple years after the Whole Earth image came out that there was a parallel movement going on, not just in environmentalism, but around the U.S. and the world. There was a lot of civil strife, not unlike what's going on today. It was 1968. There was the Martin Luther King assassination, the Robert Kennedy assassination. It was the height of the Vietnam War. There was a lot of distrust in civilization itself. And so a lot of young people wanted to disengage from society and go what they called back to the land. And so Stewart saw a lot of the cities empty, not unlike what's going on now with coronavirus and these protests. But what Stewart saw was that these liberal arts students and young 19-year-olds had no idea how to build a water pump or how to grow wheat. And so Stewart had put together a compendium of information on how to go back to the land. And it was a futuristic take on how to rebuild society. It wasn't just how to rebuild a primitive society, but it was how to rebuild a society that you'd want to live in, complete with electronics and televisions and also sort of backwards facing on how to churn your own butter. And that compendium became known as the Whole Earth Catalogue. And it came out every, I think, quarter or every half year, spring and fall edition. And it changed the world. Steve Jobs called it the Bible of the counterculture. Everybody from Al Gore to more conservative people had a copy of the Whole Earth Catalogue. It was seen as just tools for reinventing the world.
And I mean, I think, and I duly note your Earth flag on the wall, and I think your comments about 68 are interesting. Not that this is a political show, but increasingly, when I've been thinking about the election that's about going to happen in a few months' time, it starts feeling more and more like in that way as the 1968 election. So it will be. I think the timeliness of all this is apparent. But yeah, the tagline was access to tools. The title of your film comes from the introduction, doesn't it? We are as gods and might as well get good at it. And then even at the end, Steve Jobs noted it closed with "Stay hungry, stay foolish." I think those are some three interesting quotes there. I think you've talked about the access to tools, and I think someone else refers to it as like the Google of its time, but on paper. But we are as gods and might as well get good at it. What does Stewart mean by that?
Well, so we are as gods, we might as well get good at it. It's funny. It sounds a lot like, you know how some people accuse scientists of playing God. That's an often quoted line in, say, a bad TV movie or show. It's like, oh, scientists thought they were playing God. We're trying to play God, and they created the zombie, virus that made us all turn into monstrous zombies and attack each other. Well, it sounds like that, but I think what Stewart is saying is, from the beginning of mankind, you pick up a stick and you can create fire. We have slowly emerged from the adolescence of our species. And bit by bit, it's always been by using tools and by figuring out ways to survive in our environment. And for the most part, the tools have been something that have been beneficial to us, protecting our families, getting food, even being able to store food. Everything we build is beneficial to us as a species. But there's been a complete imbalance about how we treat the environment that we're around. I mean, we treat the environment like it's a resource that we can plunder and destroy, and there won't be consequences because, after all, the globe is so big. And that turns out that that's very, very wrong. I mean, what we've seen is that humanity has had, by creating more tools and more systems to protect ourselves and the things we care about, we're doing more and more damage to the world. And we've gotten to the point, especially in the last couple of centuries, where we are so powerful, our technology and tools are so immensely unbelievable, our ancestors wouldn't be able to recognize it as anything other than godlike. Right? I mean, we fly in the air. We can use energy to move vehicles. We can do all sorts of things that just seem like magic, even a few hundred years ago. And so, we are as gods to Stewart. We are as gods because we have the technology and the power to do what we want to do. But we are bad gods in the sense in that we are destroying the planet in the process of looking after those things that we're interested in. So the idea is, well, what if we became good gods? What if we became, instead just of trying to consume energy and make ourselves more comfortable, we did that, but also to the benefit of the planet. We started to restore the ecosystems that we ourselves have destroyed. We started to reverse the extinctions that we ourselves have caused. We started to suck carbon out of the air that we ourselves put in there, thereby causing climate change. According to Stewart and the people who are thinking like him, let's stop pretending that we are ever going to stop, consuming and protecting ourselves and making ourselves more comfortable. But let's do that only with the benefit of the planet in mind as well. And so that's the balance that he's trying to hit with that quote, as far as I understand it.
And then I guess, David, he amends that quote slightly, doesn't he? I think towards the end of your film, even saying that, because it probably, I don't know, maybe he recognizes it's a bit of the way that quote's been misunderstood. I think he says we are as nature or something to that effect. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Well, that was interesting. He said that towards the very end of our production. I mean, he had been saying we are as gods, like you point out, since the 1960s. And just through the course of our film, he started to, maybe it's because our film focused on these issues so much, he was reconsidering it, but he kind of has a sort of, it's not a change of heart. I think he means to say it's the same thing, but I think he finally realized, well, maybe there's a better way to say what I've been saying. And you're right. His idea was maybe we are as nature. He wants to use nature to do things that nature was doing anyway, but for the benefit of nature. So why can't we, take our part into the ecosystems that we've destroyed by repairing those ecosystems in the same way that nature would? So it's an interesting thought. I mean, I think somebody could write a philosophy paper about it, honestly.
Well, I think, there's so many aspects to this individual. I think the next one, and as they say in the industry, we should, it's better to show than tell. But Jason, maybe you can give us a setup to the clip we're about to see that's about the computer hackers, and it's this other side to Stewart Brand, the guy who really truly was there at the advent of the internet and all these other things that happen in tech and in the computer industry.
Yeah, this is probably what Stewart is best known for, at least in technology and in personal computing. But the clip you're about to watch recounts the history of the first hackers conference and how that brought together people that would later become sort of lions of their field and sort of titans of industry. But this chapter of Stewart's life is a continuation of the Whole Earth Catalogue, access to tools. The latest tool in the toolkit was personal computers, and they had just come out. The Apple I, I think, came out in 1984. So they were just starting to emerge in the consumer market, and Stewart saw this as a potential to give humans superpowers. And so the clip you're about to watch is everybody discussing this awesome new power that was at their fingertips and Stewart's involvement in it.
Okay, well, let's watch that clip.
That's my soul is in that. Tools I will give away to anybody.
The software I wrote is a desk accessory, so it works on top of any other application.
It's this program that allows you to switch very quickly between programs on the Mac, as I can show you here.
Stewart was the first guy to get it. The personal computer was one of the most powerful examples of using machines as tools for independence, and that you could build your own world out of this new technology. He saw that hackers culture shared a lot of values with the Whole Earth Catalogue ideal, and that information should be freely shared.
Stewart was one of the first people who realized that that actually was a social movement. That wasn't just like a couple of new toys that had appeared. That's a very typical Stewart thing, to understand that there is something there, to take it seriously, to give it a name. As soon as you call a situation something, the people within it start to look around and say, oh yeah, it is something. Yeah, okay, we're in something together.
Okay, I think that's a great clip. We've got some great images there. We're all going to start looking like the guys from the Homebrew Computer Club pretty soon with our lockdown haircuts and beards and whatever. But we got Wozniak, you got Jobs, you got so many other individuals and quite incredible scenes there. Let's. I mean, I've been dwelling a lot on the sort of Brand's more distant past, but let's bring this more up to the current time because we couldn't even begin to touch on everything that Stewart Brand has had his hands in. But as you said early on, the sort of the especially as part of the story arc, it's all about this de-extinction movement that Stewart is now part of. And David, maybe you could explain that, and then maybe even why that was the focus of the film, besides the fact that it's what Stewart's focusing on now.
So if your viewers see the film, they'll know basically it's essentially Jurassic Park, right? It comes with all the moral quandaries and arguments and interesting opportunities that Jurassic Park came with, and why it's such a great story. Except for dinosaurs, there's no DNA remaining from those animals. They've deceased way too long ago. But there is a lot of DNA for animals that we've killed off ourselves as humans. So woolly mammoth or the Tasmanian tiger. There's actual museums around the world that have flesh specimens of these animals. Well, I don't need to explain to your viewers, that there's DNA in there, that we can collect that DNA, we can sequence it, we can figure out what it said. Well, if we can piece enough of those together and combine them with other proximate species, we could, in theory, once you solve a bunch of bioengineering problems that would come with giving birth to one of these animals, you could, in theory, create a population of animals that are big enough to support themselves and go back into the ecosystem that they once were. And so when you think about an animal like the Tasmanian tiger that was once an apex predator for its region, there's been no replacement for it. It's just become a less robust system since we humans have killed off that animal. So what if we introduce the apex predator of the Tasmanian tiger back to it? Wouldn't the ecosystem just start to go back to the way it was? It might be a little bit different, but the answer, some say, is yes. We'd basically be in the process of repairing those ecosystems. So, it's essentially a conservation, an ecosystem repair effort, and it comes with all those delicious problems that Jurassic Park came with, which is like, well, you don't know the unintended consequences. What's going to happen? Things have changed so much. Isn't the animal different enough from the original animal? And we don't know what will happen there. And there's all these questions that are worth asking. And how do you, how do politics work with this? I mean, do we have to regulate this? Who's doing this? Who's deciding which animals get de-extincted and to what ecosystems they are returned? So we're entering a century of biotech, and the world's going to change as dramatically and probably more than the world changed with the Industrial Revolution. And so, we're going to have conversations about these topics. And so Jason and our hope with this film is that the film kind of helps people start those conversations. Should we be doing this? Should we not be doing this? What does it look like? And so on.
Well, I think that's a very good point. It brings me to the next question I wanted to ask you, because as we all know, any great documentary, you definitely have the main subject, but most great documentaries are about something else, really, when it comes down to it. And so I wanted to ask both of you, and we can start with Jason since we haven't asked you a question in a little while. What do you see as this film really being all about? Is it about hubris? Is it about folly? What do you think?
Well, yeah, we hope the film has many meanings because it's a mirror of Stewart Brand, who's a complicated character. Stewart is a guy that you can't easily pigeonhole and say, oh, you do this one thing really well. He's lived an extraordinary life. And so in keeping with Stewart Brand's varied, extraordinary life, from counterculture to environmentalism to hackers to biotech. We want this film to touch on many issues, but I think in a way, the one common thread that every chapter of Stewart life touches goes back to that original title of the movie, which is "We Are as Gods." As David so eloquently put when he gave his description of the title, but every element of Stewart's life, from counterculture taking acid and having a revolution of mind, that's acting as a god. Being environmentalist, knowing that you can control the fate of the oceans and the tides and the weather, that is being a god. Computers, you have the ability to actually take code and manifest, computer technology that actually changes your physical reality. That's acting like a god. And then biotech itself is playing with life, the code of life, the same way that the hackers played with the computer code. That is acting like a god. So we think this is, it's sort of, catching people up to the power that we currently have when we all feel so sort of neutered and aimless, that we actually have this ability to be gods. So I think if the film had to be boiled down to its quintessence, it would have to go back to the title.
And well, I was going to take it to David, but Jason, you brought so eloquently. You brought up some very good points that I think may lead to a bit of an odd question. But as you said, he's at the forefront of all these different movements, mind-expanding drugs. But you even have an element of the film. You don't directly have a cause and effect, but it wasn't very soon after. It was soon after that he went through a bout of depression. He's big on technology, but yet you could argue technology is leading to these shortening attention spans that get mentioned in the film. He's leading the environmental movement, but it's an environmental movement, and this is not meant to, spoiler alert, I guess, but which rejects technical intervention, which is what he's trying to do. So is he a happy man?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Are any of us happy? I think it's sort of an existential question. He's complicated. It's a complicated, messy answer. He in the movie, we discuss it in detail that Stewart had bouts of depression, sort of, really catatonic sadness that I think we could call it suicidal. His diaries indicated it was suicidal. That's happened a couple times in his life. I think people who are firing on all cylinders, tend to have that dark side. I know Elon Musk, while not a popular figure to bring up lately, he's admitted that he struggled with bipolar disorder. I think there's a lot of people out there who are so prolific in their public life that they're manic in a way that's been rewarded by our capitalist system that requires people to function on firing on jet fuel. But there's a crash that happens at the end of it, and I think Stewart definitely had that crash, and it was tied to drugs, but also just in being relentless in his pursuit of what he was trying to do. So yeah, I think a lot of people who are public figures who do extraordinary things have that ability to deplete their resources and their reserves, and they just crash. And Stewart, that's happened, I think he said a handful of times in his life, different sort of impetuses that brought on that depression. I do think that at the end of the day, Stewart is in this incredibly loving partnership with his wife, who's also his business partner with their nonprofit to help bring back extinct species. Stewart has a really great group of friends. They're all, they all are doing extraordinary things together. So I think it's fair to say that Stewart is happy. He's also a relentless optimist in a way when there's not a lot to be optimistic about. A lot of times journalists will often go to Stewart to go get some pull quote of sort of Steven Pinker-esque we're better than the world indicates or the data says, or that things are actually on the right end of the curve. Like even in this coronavirus world, Stewart is relentlessly optimistic about how we get out of this. So yeah, I think his wife calls him America's last great optimist, which I think is accurate. So I think he's happy.
That could have been another title for the film. But I think you've got a good one anyway. But speaking of going on all cylinders and then ultimately crashing, I think we need to give our listeners a break so they don't crash. And we will be back after that break here. You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America. Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with David Alvarado and Jason Sussberg, directors and producers of We Are as Gods. We've been talking about Stewart Brand, but I wanted to now focus more on the project, the film itself, the making of it, and some other issues and challenges you faced. David, maybe I can start with you. How did you all get involved with this project?
Well, Jason and I have always been interested, as long as we've been working together for the last 10 years. We've been interested in making feature-length or long-form documentaries about science, health, technology, and nature. Those are our sort of our areas of interest and expertise as filmmakers. But we always try to go through a human lens, right? Like stories are about people. They're seldom about things or information, for example. So we love Nova. Nova's great production, but when you have a Nova documentary, it's more about the facts are the drama, and you just learn throughout the whole hour-long piece. For us, the people are what's interesting. The desire for a person to accomplish a task, and then the antagonizing forces that will try to prevent them. That's what excites us in a story. And so Jason had known about Stewart Brand since he was in college. I had heard about him before. I thought he had something more to do with computers than anything else. But we had learned in 2014 about his effort to de-extinct animals, and so that caught our attention. And then when we dove into it, we learned, that it's something he's trying to do right now, that there are these people who think he shouldn't be doing it. And we said, there's just got to be a documentary here somewhere, somehow. And so we contacted him, and for about 3 or 4 years, tried to convince him to let us into his life. And eventually he said yes. And that's how it began.
And so once he said yes, then he was on the project. You were working with him. Does he have a credit beyond being the subject of the film?
No credit. He also didn't see like all of our subjects, they do not see the film until it's done. Sometimes we give the option to watch it before the release, but our last film was about American science educator Bill Nye the Science Guy, and Bill didn't see the film about him until we were sitting in an audience in Austin, Texas at South by Southwest. That's the first time he saw it was with 1,000 other people. And so, we don't give credits to our subjects, but it is still collaborative. I mean, we don't film things that they don't want filmed. It's not a got you production or anything like that. Of course, we can't, the way that we do our films, it's not like we're just looking at archival footage and then weaving interviews with Stewart. We're actually following him around. So we are active participants in his life as we filmed the doc.
Yeah, you had to travel the globe, didn't you?
Yeah. Went to Siberia. There's this place called Pleistocene Park. So you think Jurassic Park, this is Pleistocene Park. And, these Russian scientists are trying to rebuild the ecosystem so that when George Church, the scientist at Harvard trying to create this mammoth, can release the mammoth, it has a place to live. And so we went there with Stewart and George, and it was quite an adventure.
And Jason, Brian Eno, how did you all manage that? That's incredible.
Yeah, that was one of the delights of the project, to be honest. I've been a Brian Eno fan since I can remember. I think his work is so made for documentary. I think every film student in the world uses Brian Eno as temp music to like cheat their emotion or to like evoke a film score. And I was certainly guilty of that decades ago when I first started getting into filmmaking. And as it happens, Stewart and Brian Eno are collaborators, of course, because Stewart has always touched just random individuals since the beginning of time. And so those two were friends from the Whole Earth Catalogue days. And they actually are working together on this sort of the last chapter of the movie, is this clock that's in West Texas called the Clock of the Long Now, which is a monumental engineered artifact that is meant to make us meditate on long-term thinking. It's sort of like a philosophical art piece, and to get humans to not only think about their lives, their kids' lives and their grandkids' lives, but to think in these 10,000 year increments, which is how long civilization has been together. And so Brian, and Stewart started cooking up this idea along with engineer Danny Hillis on what this clock is going to look and feel like. And Brian is the soundscape, I guess you could call him a soundscape artist or engineer of what the clock will sound like. And so they're on the board of this foundation called the Long Now Foundation, which is in effect building the clock and is maintaining. They hope to be maintaining civilization for 10,000 years, or getting humans to think that we need to maintain civilization for 10,000 years. So we interviewed Brian as a subject in the documentary because they're just very good friends, Stewart and Brian. But also, Brian Eno's he's an erudite guy. He's not just a punk rocker who wears silly outfits and performs in amazing bands. He's a very scholarly guy. Going to his studio, he just has books and books on his wall, this library of just varied interests. And so he kind of acts as a de facto historian in Stewart's life. So we bring him in the interviews to explain the environmental movement, to explain hackers, to explain the clock along now. Brian's fingerprints are all over the movie. And so when it came time to come up with a score, we asked him, and his initial answer, Stewart actually did the asking for us, was, I don't have time. I've retired from music. Here, well, I'll let you play with my library, and if you come up with something, great. But then that changed. He got really invested in the movie and ended up coming up with 25 original pieces of music that he found inspiration from the movie to build, and shared them with us. That was a really great turn of events.
And since you brought it up, I hadn't mentioned it, but the 10,000 year clock. I mean, and it isn't. I think it's near Van Horn, Texas. I mean, is anyone ever going to see this? This thing's built into the side of a mountain. How is it? Do they plan to have visitors? How is that going to work? Do you know?
Yeah, it's meant to be a public project. So obviously, it's not ready for the public quite yet. But the idea is that it is going to be a pilgrimage site that people have to go to and get to go to. So I think it was proposed to be originally in the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada mountains in Nevada, but they ended up building it on actually on Jeff Bezos' land in Texas. They got it as sort of a donation from Jeff Bezos, and it's funded by Jeff Bezos. We don't bring this up in the movie, but that is sort of just an accident that it happens to be in this area that not a lot of people can access. But they will eventually have roads out there and a system for transport. But it was really it really was a pilgrimage site. In America, you can pretty much get anywhere within a day. But that was we had to fly into West Texas, drive, where I don't even recall where it was. It was actually
flew into El Paso and then drove a couple hours to Van Horn.
Wow.
And then from Van Horn, you took a system of roads. Yeah, so I think we had to wake up at like 3:00 in the morning to get there by sunrise. It was a pilgrimage.
Hey, last point I wanted to raise, sort of on the film itself, is and now direct this to David. I mean, how did you come about with the story arc? The way you were talking about earlier about weaving the story on this tapestry that you made. Was that a joint collaborative effort that you guys came up with, or was that, whose idea was that?
Yeah, well, it's we have a very collaborative process, and at the center of it is our longtime collaborator Anuka Lilia. She's an editor here in New York who is just a fantastically talented person and has a real eye for what's the emotional curvature of stories and how characters can be developed in a documentary. And we work very closely. I mean, some directors do just sort of hand it to the editor and show up for reviews. We are in the edit room with her and our other edit team. We had a large post-production team. And even our producers, that we're all like sitting around in a room in our New York office trying to figure out how to bring the story together. And so it's a very organic process where we allow the footage to tell us how this can be arranged. And so given the immensity of Stewart's life, his biography, it was a process of figuring out, well, we have 90 minutes here. That's the bucket this thing needs to fit into. What are the storylines that matter most to us? And then, so what do we need to eliminate? And then once we have that figured out, how do we combine those in a way that makes sense? And some of it is based on experience, like we know how stories come together, and that's a process. But also a lot of it is intuition, honestly, just trying one version of an edit of a 90-minute film that we think could work, and then seeing what doesn't work about that, and then rearranging, whole scenes and what's inside those scenes, and how does this scene go to this scene? It does, but not if we go to this scene. So why don't I do this? It's a process that just always takes us a year or so to finish, and it's definitely a large part of the cost, but it's also part of I think what makes our films so special. The amount of love and blood and sweat and tears we pour into it until the film speaks to us and tells us like how it best fits together.
Well, I mean, I think that brings nice segue to what I wanted to talk to you about next, which is, speaking of finishing your film in blood, sweat, and tears. Is it right? You finished, Jason, I'll throw this one to you. You finished the film the day South by Southwest was canceled. Is that right? Where you guys were going to premiere this film? Yeah,
that was, every film is very difficult to finish, and you never know where it's going to go or what the future holds or how audiences are going to react with it. But you always get to take it to a public audience to test it. And so this film was particularly, difficult to finish just because it took so much time, and the story was difficult, and Stewart's life was so complex. We just wanted to do it justice. But we ended up we were sitting in Skywalker Sound in Marin, California, where we were working with this legendary sound mixer named sound mixer named Pete Horner, who's done Jurassic Park and just amazing titles. And he's working on our little boutique indie movie. It was lunchtime of the last day of the sound mix after a nearly 3-year journey where we're about to print the movie to send it to South by Southwest weeks after it was actually due. I should mention that. Everyone else turned their movie in February. We are turning our film in on March 6th. We get a news alert. Actually, David got a news alert on his phone from a friend who said, "Condolences, sorry about South by Southwest being canceled." And we kind of dismissed it. We're like, ha ha ha, he doesn't know what he's talking about. It's not canceled. And we went to lunch, and where we have 4 hours left in the sound studio before we print, and we learned it was canceled. And so we then spent the time that we should have been spending lavishing attention on the last bit of the mix of the movie, just in the hallway, frantically fielding phone calls from our investors, our producers, Stewart himself, the other subjects. Everyone was sort of wondering what the hell happened. And so, yeah, we finished it the day it was canceled.
I mean, it's not nearly the same, but there's a generation out there that says they know where they were when they heard the news that JFK had been shot. I know exactly where I was when I heard that South by had been canceled. I was just down the other side of this house, actually, because I was supposed to be doing this interview with you face to face. We had arranged to meet in Austin, and I still ended up going to Texas, but scrambled to get back here to the UK, I will say, in the end. But one thing, David, I know there's the article in Variety, and you talked about the importance of festivals, especially for indie filmmakers. I mean, do you have any further thoughts on that? The landscape's constantly changing, and we don't know how it's going to end. But any views on how it's looking like on that front?
Well, what's funny is we take personal conferences with other filmmakers in our community all the time during the course of this pandemic to ask each other, what's going on? What are you guys doing? What are people saying? What are your sales reps saying? And so on. And it just seems even today, everybody's just as confused as before. And the source of confusion is that festivals have traditionally, for independent filmmakers, have traditionally been, the only path to getting the amount of attention needed to leverage that against a sale and try to get the sale, to be a higher number. And so without the film festivals, because there is no other real system, it's been very hard to get back to it. So the question has now become, well, do we show these films online and hope that that'll gain the same amount of interest? Or do we wait until the pandemic is over? Essentially waiting on science to create a vaccine. That's your new distribution plan. to wait on a vaccine. So some people, it turns out, can't. They need to get the film out. They'll take any number, take a smaller number from a smaller distributor and worry about when that could actually be shown later. And others, I think Jason and I are fortunate in that this film isn't very tied to our times. I mean, I think it's a large film that could be very interesting to somebody in 2021 or 2022 as much as it is in 2020. So we're actually taking the stance of, well, let's just wait until the world's back to normal and maybe release the film into that world. But who knows? I mean, people are talking, and it could very well be true that the entire film industry might be changed from this. I mean, why are we so tied to film festivals? Why aren't we working with buyers sooner? Instead of selling after we're done? They're all good questions, and we'll see.
Only thing I would say is I guess Stewart would tell you to take the 10,000-year horizon, basically.
Yeah.
Not be thinking in terms of 2021 or 22.
Right.
But so our listeners know, is there a place where people can watch the film yet?
Right now, no. Unfortunately, we're not showing it in film festivals. We are applying to new ones in 2021. So, essentially, if you go to our website, weareasgods.film, you'll be able to keep up with the latest information about the film.
Okay, well, that's how we usually end the podcast, but thanks for sharing that, because I think that's we do like to know how we can follow you guys. It's the same Variety article you talked about we've talked about distributors. How do your investors feel? How does Stewart feel about all this? Jason, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think everybody is crestfallen that we put all this time and had this plan and we weren't able to get the film out. So everybody feels just rotten about how this film has met the world, which is it hasn't met the world. Just for a minute, talk hyperbolically, but we call it a stillborn movie because it's here. It's just not available. So it's just there's a ton of emotion wrapped up into this, but everybody's been really understanding. The investors are fully on board. They take our lead on this. Our partner on this, Strike Films, has just been nothing but supportive and understanding. We can't really, we're only one, we are but a cog in a larger system. The system of in fact, the film industry is just a similar cog in a larger system. So we can't really dictate the terms. We can't really speed things along personally. So there's no culpability. They've just been very understanding. Stewart is, I think, Stewart loves the movie and loves participating in virtual Q&As with with private screening groups that we've shared the film with, including his foundation and a few others. But I think he's impatient. He wants to get the film out there, but he understands that this is it's going to take its own time getting out into the world. But he's going to be 83 this year. There's a biography being made about his life by the journalist John Markoff, and so I think he's just ready to share this chapter of his life, and he loves these virtual screenings where you can watch the film and then rewatch it and pause it if you didn't hear it, and think contemplative thoughts and make notes. And so he actually loves the streaming of the movie and thinks that it should be available to people. And we agree with him. We got to get this film out there so that people can enjoy it, but it has to take its own time, and we have to share it in the theater.
And so I think it's hard to believe, but we've already come to close to coming to the end of our time. One last question for you. I mean, what are any next projects? You guys have collaborated on some great films so far. Is there another one in the works now?
Yeah, we're working on a few. We're developing 2 series. We're not sure if they'll take off, and then we're also researching 2 other potential feature docs, all science, health, technology. And so we're really excited to figure out how to begin a project in a pandemic world, such so that we can take advantage of our time locked away in our apartments and do the research. But then when the world is ready, we can just rush out the gate, running.
Well, as we'll be watching this space, and we'll certainly have links to your websites and other maybe social media accounts in the show notes. I just wanted to thank you, David Alvarado and Jason Sussberg, for coming on the Factual America podcast. It's been a lovely and very enjoyable hour spent with you. I also want to highly recommend. I'm one of the privileged few, beyond Stewart Brand and his few mates, to have actually seen this film. And thanks for sharing that with me. It is excellent. I don't just say that. I really, really enjoyed it. And I'm sure when it comes out, you've got a winner on your hands. So I wish you the best of luck with that. Again, just to remind people, the film we have been talking about is We Are as Gods, and David and Jason are the directors and producers. Also want to remind you to remember to like us and share us with your friends and family wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. And this is Factual America, signing off. You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.